As we walked up the trail, Andy spoke longingly of the woman with whom he lived, a physician named Fiona McPherson. As we rested on a rock, he pulled a picture out of his pack to show me. She was tall, blonde, athletic-looking. Andy said he and Fiona were in the midst of building a house together in the hills outside of Queenstown. Waxing ardent about the uncomplicated pleasures of sawing rafters and pounding nails, Andy admitted that when Rob had first offered him this Everest job, he'd been ambivalent about accepting it. It was quite hard to leave Fee in the house, actually. We'd only just gotten the roof on, yeah? But how can you turn down a chance to climb Everest? Especially when you have an opportunity to work alongside somebody like Rob Hall. Although Andy had never been to Everest before, he was no stranger to the Himalaya. In 1985, he climbed a difficult 21,927-foot peak called Chobutsi, about 30 miles west of Everest. And in the fall of 1994, he spent 4 months helping Fiona run the medical clinic in Ferishin, a gloomy, wind-battered hamlet 14,000 feet above sea level, where we stayed the nights of April 4th and 5th. The clinic was funded by a foundation called the Himalayan Rescue Association, primarily to treat altitude-related illnesses, although it also offered free treatment to the local Sherpas, and to educate trekkers about the insidious hazards of ascending too high, too fast. At the time of our visit, the staff at the 4-room facility included a French physician, Cécile Bouvray, a pair of young American physicians, Larry Silver and Jim Litch, and an energetic environmental lawyer named Laura Ziemer, also American, who was assisting Litch. It had been established in 1973 after 4 members of a single Japanese trekking group succumbed to the altitude and died in the vicinity. Prior to the clinic's existence, acute altitude illness killed approximately 1 or 2 out of every 500 trekkers who passed through Ferishin. Ziemer emphasized that this alarming death rate hadn't been skewed upward by mountaineering accidents. The victims had been just ordinary trekkers who never ventured beyond the established trails. Now, thanks to the educational seminars and emergency care provided by the clinic's volunteer staff, that mortality rate has been cut to less than 1 death per 30,000 trekkers. Although idealistic Westerners like Ziemer, who work at the Ferishin Clinic, receive no remuneration and must even pay their own travel expenses to and from Nepal, it is a prestigious posting that attracts highly qualified applicants from around the world. Caroline McKenzie, Hall's expedition doctor, had worked at the HRA clinic with Fiona McPherson and Andy in the autumn of 1994. In 1990, the year Hall first summited Everest, the clinic was run by an accomplished, self-confident physician from New Zealand named Jan Arnold. Hall met her as he passed through Ferishin on his way to the mountain, and he was immediately smitten. "I asked Jan to go out with me as soon as I got down from Everest," Hall reminisced during our first night in the village. "For our first date, I proposed going to Alaska and climbing Mount McKinley together, and she said yes." They were married 2 years later. In 1993, Arnold climbed to the summit of Everest with Hall. In 1994 and 1995, she traveled to base camp to work as the expedition doctor. Arnold would have returned to the mountain again this year, except that she was 7 months pregnant with their first child, so the job went to Dr. McKenzie. After dinner on Thursday, our first night in Ferishin, Laura Ziemer and Jim Litch invited Hall, Harris, and Helen Wilton, our base camp manager, over to the clinic to raise a glass and catch up on gossip. Over the course of the evening, the conversation drifted to the inherent risks of climbing and guiding Everest. And Litch remembers the discussion with chilling clarity. Hall, Harris, and Litch were in complete agreement that sooner or later a major disaster involving a large number of clients was inevitable. But said Litch, who had climbed Everest from Tibet the previous spring, Rob's feeling was that it wouldn't be him. He was just worried about having to save another team's ass, and that when the unavoidable calamity struck, he was sure it would occur on the more dangerous north side of the peak, the Tibetan side. On Saturday, April 6th, a few hours above Ferishin, we arrived at the lower end of the Khumbu Glacier, a 12-mile tongue of ice that flows down from the south flank of Everest and would serve as our highway, I hoped mightily, to the summit. At 16,000 feet now, we'd left behind the last trace of green. 20 stone monuments stood in a somber row, along the crest of the glacier's terminal moraine, overlooking the mist-filled valley, memorials to climbers who had died on Everest, most of them Sherpa. From this point forward, our world would be a barren, monochromatic expanse of rock and wind-blown ice. And despite our measured pace, I had begun to feel the effects of the altitude, which left me lightheaded and constantly fighting for breath. The trail here remained buried beneath a head-high winter snowpack in many places. As the snow softened in the afternoon sun, the hoofs of our yaks punched through the frozen crust, and the beasts wallowed to their bellies. The grumbling yak drivers thrashed their animals to force them onward and threatened to turn around. Late in the day, we reached a village called Lobuje, and there sought refuge from the wind in a cramped, spectacularly filthy lodge. A collection of low tumble-down buildings huddled against the elements at the edge of the Khumbu Glacier. Lobuje was a grim place, crowded with Sherpas and climbers from a dozen different expeditions, German trekkers, herds of emaciated yaks, all bound for Everest Base Camp, still a day's travel up the valley. The bottleneck, Rob explained, was due to the unusually late and heavy snowpack, which until just yesterday had kept any yaks at all from reaching base camp. The hamlet's half-dozen lodges were completely full. Tents were jammed side by side on the few patches of muddy earth not covered with snow. Scores of Rai and Tamang porters from the low foothills, dressed in thin rags and flip-flops, they were working as load bearers for various expeditions, were bivouacked in caves and under boulders on the surrounding slopes. The 3 or 4 stone toilets in the village were literally overflowing with excrement. The latrines were so abhorrent that most people, Nepalese and Westerners alike, evacuated their bowels outside on the open ground, wherever the urge struck. Huge, stinking piles of human feces lay everywhere. It was impossible not to walk in it. The river of snowmelt meandering through the center of the settlement was an open sewer. The main room of the lodge where we stayed was furnished with wooden bunk platforms for some 30 people. I found an unoccupied bunk on the upper level, shook as many fleas and lice as possible from the soiled mattress, and spread out my sleeping bag. Against the near wall was a small iron stove that supplied heat by burning dried yak dung. After sunset, the temperature dropped well below freezing, and porters flocked in from the cruel night to warm themselves around the stove. Because dung burns poorly under the best of circumstances, and especially so in the oxygen-depleted air of 16,200 feet, the lodge filled with dense, acrid smoke, as if the exhaust from a diesel bus were being piped directly into the room. Twice during the night, coughing uncontrollably, I had to flee outside for air. By morning, my eyes were burning and bloodshot, my nostrils were clogged with black soot, and I'd developed a dry, persistent hack that would stay with me until the end of the expedition.